Okay, that's you guys. That's me. Let's get into this. I'm going to grab my phone because that's where I wrote the questions down on. But I do remember the first question. Do you guys want to give an actual intro to your projects specifically, and maybe in your own words, and discuss where you see that playing the role of internet resilience? To start with you, Skirts.
Starting with me. Are you sure?
I mean, yeah, you're late.
All right. So I'm Ethan. I co-founded Cosmos some number of years ago. Cosmos is all about the values of sovereignty and interoperability and what we call the community computer revolution. So, just like personal computers revolutionized the way we interact with a certain kind of computing technology built out of silicon, we believe that community computers will revolutionize this new kind of technology built out of consensus. And, every community should have the right to have their own computer, basically, that serves them and their values, and those sovereign computers should be interoperable with each other. So community computer is just the term we use for blockchains. These days I'm running a company called Informal Systems. We're structured as a workers' cooperative, and our mission is to transform three key institutions in society, the quality standards of which we believe are all too low. And the interchain and these community computers are the key to doing that, and those institutions are software, how we build and deploy it, money, how we issue and distribute it, and organizations, how we own and govern them, and all of that is in service of a more sort of resilient infrastructure.
Okay, nice. We'll get into that in a second. Would you like to go, Costanza?
Hi, so I work for the Swarm Foundation, a decentralized and censorship-resistant storage system that empowers digital freedoms. So when you upload a file, a website, or anything else on the Swarm network, it gets distributed in a decentralized way, and that enables both a bigger privacy focus and zero-leaks communications, and also censorship-resistant, meaning that everyone, everywhere can have access to the content, regardless of barriers or other systems in place to prevent people from having freedom of information.
All right, cool.
I know, we should get some more snaps in here, people. I need some audience participation.
We need to make everyone who didn't come feel really bad, right?
Yeah. I'm Adrian. I'm one of the co-founders of Anoma and Nomada. Very briefly, Nomada is multi-chain interchain asset agnostic privacy. It's the ability to have unified privacy sets for arbitrary assets, no matter where they were created. Fundamentally, in the multi-chain vision, I think anyone that believes that there will be one blockchain to rule them all is kind of out of their mind at this point. And yeah, then Anoma, third generation architecture that's intent-centric, which really means partial transactions, so that you can have true global composability at scale to build local coordination systems effectively. Because the nice thing is you can build infrastructure that is latency tolerant effectively, so that if you're in a village, you can use Anoma as an infrastructure to run your local commerce, and when you get connectivity to some higher order system again, then you can sort of do on-demand syncs at that point. But you can handle the ability for individual pockets to be disconnected, and at that point you can only do local coordination, but as soon as you regain connectivity, you can do global coordination.
I have questions. Continue. Eli, let's get some stats.
Hi, I'm Eli. I'm a co-founder of a collective or multidisciplinary firm, whatever you want to call it, primarily focused on stewarding protocols or projects via on-chain participation, governance, and open source contributions. One of the more boring people on this panel, probably.
Okay, so I trying really hard not to get immediately into the Anoma question. I'm going to do a little bit of due diligence here. So let's just start this off quickly with, who is the internet built for? Adrian, let's start with you, and then Costanza, let's go to you, and then you guys can duke it out who goes after. Who is the internet built for, and how do you personally see the evolution of the internet playing out in the next 2 decades?
The internet was originally built by people that liked sort of censorship-resistant communication. If you look at sort of the 80s and 90s, this is really the base idea behind the internet protocols. And to a large extent, the basic internet protocols still fulfill this role. Really just allowing fairly free and ad hoc communications networks to form, right? Like we can have censorships going on in France. This doesn't impact the internet connectivity in Switzerland or Germany. Likewise, the same is true in Russia. Mostly because TCP/IP is like a fairly well-designed protocol for like global network connectivity. Over the last, let's call it 20 years or so, this has become less true because we had this great decentralized infrastructure, and then we built all these services on top that all started living in the same single data center in San Francisco. And now when that thing goes down, everyone starts losing what they consider the internet, right? Like I think different people, like if you sort of grew up in, I don't know, if you like used computers in the 90s, you have a very different view of how the internet used to be structured than if you grew up in like the last 10 years, because nowadays you really look at this and like, Snapchat is the internet, or like Facebook is the internet, Twitter is the internet, right? Like that's not the actual thing, that's just a service built on top of it. I think in the next 20 years, we're sort of going to see the move back towards actually decentralized protocols built on top of the existing internet primitives that can be run locally. I think really we're going to see this unbundling of services that currently run out of Menlo Park, moving into not necessarily people's phones, but rather like local communities where like your village runs their own settlement system for their local commerce. Yeah, I think that's sort of the move we're going to see.
I like that answer. Let's go to Costanza and further, I mean, from a Swarm perspective, you guys are doing a lot of data storage in this decentralized manner, and you guys have always been very aggressive advocates of essentially roach internet infrastructure. How do you see that world of like data? Because he's talking about people are going to start maybe accepting decentralized protocols on the original internet infrastructure. How do you see that next 2 decades playing out for data storage and in general the internet?
I actually, thank you for the question. I really like your perspective because it kind of gave me some optimism that was very well needed. If I say internet as of today and with building the internet, and with profiting from the internet, then the answer is big corporations like AWS, Google, Oracle, Microsoft, and central governments. Because basically they have the power to control what goes online, monitor what goes online, who is online, and also block people from going online or from sharing content that they don't like. And this goes from the bottom level, from ISP, that they can also block you, all the way up to protocols and interfaces. So as of today, the way that we are trying to build the internet is actually to giving power back to people and making sure that the control stays within people, so that people have complete ownership over their digital rights, over the privacy, over the content, and it's not the platform owner. So in this sense, this is what we're trying to do. And if I had to imagine internet 20 years from now, the scary thing is that big corporations and governments are like organisms. They want to stay alive. They want to be relevant. So they're always going to be making the case for them to be able to control and censor and monitor what's happening. And they're always going to find a new excuse, and they're going to find something else to be able to check what goes online and what doesn't go online. Now, the good thing is that if we are successful, and I strongly believe that we are going to be successful because not only the Swarm Foundation, but so many other protocols, including the Internet Defense Alliance, is doing a great job. I think we can create a parallel internet where actually people get back control over the data, and they can be free from monopolies and from censorship. So the main example is that what we're doing is the Swarm Foundation, we developed a mirror copy of Wikipedia that can be accessed by anyone, anywhere. So this is just an example. So in my opinion, there's going to be still the control and censor internet, but also a free and empowering, parallel, sustainable network.
I really like that. Let's get some snaps, people. I thought we had that. Come on now. I want to slightly amend the question based off of that. Also, I know that Eli knows a decent amount about this, and I don't know, you probably do too. But you talked about like kind of local infrastructure when it comes to like interacting. Adrian started it, but you both highlighted something that I also was highlighting is like there is no resilience in like a local high latency or a local infrastructure of internet and communication. One of these things that to look at, we talk about the next couple of decades, is the internet already processes huge amounts of information, and I'm sure we all have like been aware of the fact that AI exists now. And so when we talk about the second class, third class citizenship that's being created by this like walled garden internet approach and this hierarchical system, we also have to talk about the fact that that is now going to evolve into something even greater and potentially more damaging to communities left behind. So I want to like, Adrian, put your mic down. This is for Eli, and then we'll go into yours. But yeah, where do you see resiliency playing into a role if even our current understanding of the internet is not one of like access for all? How do we look into AI as an evolution?
I'm not so sure on AI specifically, but I think generally speaking, people have sort of mispriced these intangibles, such as resilience, or maybe something as simple as I don't know, patronage or something like that throughout time. With information becoming more abundant or what have you, there are these intangibles, in my opinion, such as resilience, that have like, maybe think of searchability as like some other intangible that we misprice. So Google makes most of their revenue off of like advertising or something like this.
Are you saying mispriced? Does that mean undervalued? Like
no, so it's something that we value, right? So we're getting value out of searching something on Google, but it's mispriced because like what they're actually making money off of is just like advertising or something, right? So most of the value does not actually translate to like it being priced appropriately. And I think similarly we're seeing this like sort of repricing of things like resilience. I think that like crypto is a testament of that, and maybe other internet technologies as well. It seems like Skiff is doing well, and other sort of like privacy forward applications. But I think that so throughout history, a lot of these things have been mispriced, and we're finally reaching a point where they're being repriced according to like the actual value that they provide. And at the same time, you have people actually discerning what it is that they actually value. And sometimes it's as simple as not wanting to give up your information to Google or whoever it may be. So I think when it comes to resilience, there's not like a company dedicated to resilience, right? It's one of these intangibles that either people have in their back of their head, or they're maybe marginalized in some way. And so yeah, I think that that's agree. The main thing that's kind of changing.
I definitely agree, Adrian. I see you. I do want to give you a chance to say your piece as well, and then we're going to Adrian because I want you to tackle this. I can see it in your eyes. One of the questions I would bring up later is actually going to be about like Zigbee infrastructure and like Bluetooth mesh network, stuff that was really pioneered and improved from about 2004 onward, but has not seen mass adoption by any means. And like Zigbee nodes can handle 65,000 nodes and be transferring information between them seamlessly. There have been rises where people have used this tech, but when we talk about like pricing, I'm curious to see if that becomes part of it, is like those types of protocols that already exist, find ways to integrate with people who are now repricing ideas like resilience, because they've been around for a while. When we talk about this future, what do you see?
Yeah, I think this pricing point is really interesting because we've definitely been mispricing a lot of things in the world, not just in internet reality, but in our physical reality, chronically underpricing the sort of resource costs of things, environmental destruction, and it's not dissimilar in the internet and this sort of set of crises that have been, let's say, accumulating recently, the last few decades or so, are sort of prompting some kind of repricing, and AI may contribute to that and contribute to the sort of inability to actually trust things you see on the internet, right? There was this like growing, fake news sort of epidemic, and AI is arguably going to make that a lot worse, and may push for what I'm hoping for is, and I think probably a lot of us push for a more sort of localist orientation and maybe a revival of kind of real world verification and potentially further motivation for using things like web of trust models. Maybe we'll see them come back in a way where there'll be enough motivation to actually start verifying people's keys and I don't know if those parties will ever actually take off, but we still have a UX problem there. Yeah, but I mean one of the analogies I like about sort of internet, I think about internet as like a core public utility, and you think about many core utilities are provisioned locally, right? Like if you think about, I don't know, in a city, the waste removal is managed locally. Imagine if you sent all your waste to California to get cleaned, right, before getting the clean water back. I mean, that's basically what we do with the internet.
I think our waste managers manage the waste and then send it to Asia. I'm pretty sure.
Well, yeah, that's right. They export. So that's another thing we're mispricing. But we're not even there with. With the internet, we basically send all of our waste to California, and then we don't get anything clean back. We get something maybe even dirtier back. So this analogy is obviously going to break down, but
no, I love it.
Yeah, but I mean, I foresee, or at least the future I think I'm building towards, and maybe others as well, is one more focused around sort of municipal, local infrastructure, and even localized hosting of sort of information and services. And I think a big other sort of flip side of this pricing problem is the ownership problem, right? And prices are set by the owners, and they're set according to the power they have. And this is sort of becomes a problem of sort of corporate governance and the constitution of states and the alliance between state power and corporate power, and the need to push to more sort of cooperative forms of ownership. And that's what part of what was so exciting about the internet and about decentralization is this possibility of more decentralized ownership. But we're not really seeing that materialize yet. I think critique of the blockchain space is we're just replicating these sort of oligopolistic, token-based ownership structures. And so I see a really strong need to push towards more, locally verifiable, one person, kind of one vote sort of systems, or at least things that aren't just purely, token voting based, to really start to address these problems.
I agree. Adrian, get after it.
I think, so on the optimistic side that you mentioned earlier, for better or for worse, we will move towards these more decentralized services, simply because nation states, like the internet exists in this US dollar, US government hegemony. This is going to go away, it seems. This is not necessarily a good thing. Like, this is not going to be super pretty, I think. But for better or for worse, it means that the one way for small countries to survive is to decentralize, to make the infrastructure more resilient, which means I think we're going to move away from the central services hosted in California, mostly because they aren't going to be resilient enough to survive on a hostile global space. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to get there. The transition is going to be sort of messy. And to pick up on the latency point that you actually mentioned earlier in your talk, one of the big benefits of local service deployment is that you get super low latency guarantees, right? Because your latency currently when you interact with Google is bound by speed of light communication, because you must be hitting some server through some number of fiber optic cables in California. If your services get deployed locally, like the four of us could be trading Bitcoin right now at effectively whatever's possible on local area network connectivity, right? Without having to go via the central server halfway across the world. So local area network, like local services, massively reduce the cost of latency, or reduce the latency burden, let's say, of these systems. So as a result, I also think these systems are much more likely to produce better outcomes for people because you reduce the latency cost.
I agree. I think it's really important to really look at what it means to have high latency and what high latency brings when it comes to a value set. And there's different populations that have different value sets on latency. And that is something that personally my community is was involved in smuggling cadences and sneaker nets and just one message out a month that had a lot of videos and put photos and a lot of testimony. That was super valuable when it came to moving political forces to actually support this community and getting journalists into an impenetrable area and supplies and things like that. Wasn't super helpful, but that's just the nature of racism. We won't go in there. But I think it's really important to look at what latency means to people. So when we talk about these local networks, I encourage you all to Google Fourth.energy. There's a guy who's really cool, and he's basically made it to where you can also host like internet, like a mesh network site on your Ethereum node, or a mesh network like node on your Ethereum node as well. And you can both create like that local internet from the Bluetooth mechanism design, and sync yourself with essentially like a blockchain or Ethereum contract. I wanted to hear your guys' thoughts on like how, if you guys all think about building for locality, how do you, let's assume like Forth.energy or somebody else kind of also pursues that infrastructure side of things. How do you think your, like the blockchain space building for locality actually works with your products?
It mostly doesn't yet.
That's the right answer. And that's it, folks. It's been great. We got 8 minutes left. No. It doesn't, does it? It doesn't. So where we see ourselves at a bull market raising, ungodly amounts of billions and putting it into the market, but we don't value a latency system. What does that look like next bull cycle? I mean, I'm gonna be out there making shit happen, so feel free to jump into my design space. But I think, what does that look like for you guys once you see maybe there is that resilient third layer that exists, and we see billions of dollars being pushed towards a resiliency, high latency network?
I think from our perspective, this really evolves around intents or sort of partial state transitions where people individually say what they want, not how to get it. Because when you look at sort of existing designs in the space, it's really about like authorizing some computational trace that runs against some global state, right? This is what happens on Ethereum. This is what a transaction does. You authorize a number of instructions that can modify global state. This is really hard to make local because it depends on having global state that we all will sort of interact with and modify. And I think the third generation of architectures really is going to be structured around intents, where you authorize specific state changes. Like I'm willing to trade some Bitcoin for some ETH, not how to trade them, exactly who my counterparties are, but rather like I have this state and I'm willing to transition to this future state if and only if these other conditions are met. And one of the really nice properties of this is that this becomes incredibly composable, because if there's local supply that can settle this, then you should be necessarily settling this locally. This even applies to physical resources, where if you want to sell some lumber, if there's a local buyer, this is way easier to do than sort of hitting up the buyer in China, right? But this is really hard to build at the moment unless you have Anoma is like an architecture like Anoma that is really designed around these intents. So I think this is sort of where the next cycle is going to be heading, because this solves a bunch of these externalities that in the blockchain space have been recognized for weird reasons, like MEV. MEV is sort of this problem of we all modify global state, and the answer to this is not we need some more encrypted mempools. The answer to this is like we want to like have people specify specific intents and specific state changes. So I think the general acceptance, even in our space, is getting there with regarding intents as the next wave, and it just maps much better into the real world, because like real people have intents. They don't have like I'm willing to go to store X, Y, and Z and to like fulfill my shopping list. Like they want to have their shopping list fulfilled, right?
Yeah, one of the more interesting conversations that I've had more recently with the Anoma team is essentially using intents for governance. So we, when we are interacting with a governance system in crypto, it's usually very painful, very long, so on and so forth. And I think that there's an interesting opportunity to have these like social resources kind of managed by these autonomous processes, such as intents. So you have this kind of like automatic governance system based off of like people's actual preferences, right? Instead of trying to think of who to delegate to or who to elect and what have you, you now have this sort of path-independent legal system, and I think that that's one underappreciated aspect of something like intents, especially as it relates to latency.
Yep. I can see latency and intents being a good partner. Go ahead, Costanza.
I was actually thinking about what you said earlier in your speech about the concept of nomadism and of...
Nomadology?
Sorry.
No, yeah.
And that the fact that the internet that we experience here today in Paris is actually very different from the internet that people experience, for example, in Iran or in Tigray or in some other countries. So now, assuming that they do have internet connection, which is another matter altogether in terms of internet resilience. So if they can connect to the internet because that is provided, there are two main problems. One problem is that state surveillance, meaning that most of the communications is being monitored. So now, if, for example, I feel free to send a message to a friend of mine without being in danger for my life, that's not always the case for people in other countries. And the second thing is that what I can read online might not be the same that people in another country can read online. So those two problems, state surveillance and censorship, are the problems that are actually preventing local communities to fully enjoy the internet as we would like it to be. So
I think, yeah, I truly, yes, big snaps. I think the idea of nomadology is the way the internet was supposed to be designed, is meant to be designed, and it is one that unlocks access to information for everyone, despite borders, but despite political agendas and you know, what we would call people who consider themselves the only sole actor of the state, like dictators and authoritarians. I do want to, in our last couple minutes, give us a chance to like look towards that future that you're talking about, right? And we talk about intents and we talk about, you know, designing for these localities. I think it's probably worthwhile, not a shock to anybody, to realize that there's just not any research that is coming out of the blockchain space about these populations and these communities that's meaningful research. There was movements like the Million Dev March by Ethereum when it first launched, moving into places like Lagos and East Africa and bringing devs online, but that was extractive. It is all extractive. It is like, we want to add them to the Ethereum world and we're going to like let them work for us and build on like, you know, Gitcoin. Gitcoin's great, but like that is a way of like bringing people from those places in. We don't have actual research on these communities. So if you guys want to take these last couple minutes to discuss maybe how your teams would look for that future and maybe try and get some kind of actual on the ground solutions research. We can start with you this time. You're like, why you got to keep giving me the hard ones?
Yeah, well, I mean, I frankly don't know. I wouldn't assume that I know the answer to the question.
Yeah.
I would leave it to them, I guess, figure out how to empower them. I mean, I think there's always a danger of like going in and, like you said, it being a sort of extractive, oh, we have the solution for you. One of the projects I do really like that's been operating in Kenya for, I don't know, almost 2 decades now is grassroots economics, which is basically building a mutual credit system for you know, small producers in Kenya, and they do have some data now, and they have been researching this kind of actively. But it's a way to bring sort of new, more, let's say, collaborative, you know, bottom-up financial system to you know, local communities of producers in a way that, you know, empowers them and isn't about, you know, using Ethereum or anything else. It's about using whatever works to help people. And so I think these sort of, you know, if these tools can help build more resilient bottom-up financial infrastructure to empower people to, you know, not need to use, you know, colonial currencies and so on, then that can be helpful. But I think there's always a danger of, you know, people coming from the outside and trying to impose. And yeah.
Eli, you have a history in VC funding. I don't want everyone to give the same answer because, let's be honest, that's going to be the answer. So let's take that model and say, like, what does it look like from a DAO, from the DAOs that we've watched fund bullshit, or the DAOs that we've watched fund really cool stuff? Like, where does the funding aspect of the blockchain space start to work towards high latency locality?
I'm no longer a VC.
Guys, Eli's no longer a VC. Tell your friends.
However, I think it's really important that people pay more close attention to the DAOs that they actually have tokens in. I think it's as simple as that. Unfortunately, you know, governance is really painful and it's time-consuming. But I think if people want to see this sort of change, they need to first show up.
Show up. Nice. Either one of you, go.
I think we want to make it possible for people to like kind of like how Linux worked to some extent, right? Like I would not say that Linux was colonial deployed to the world. It's like it was open source software and people could pick it, and it just happened to be a very good solution for lots of people, and people could adapt it for their local needs. This is sort of what we're going with for Noma. You can take the software and download it and run it with your own local currency, with your own local assets. If you want, you can connect to the rest of the network, but you don't have to. You can run on like the 3 village elders you trust. This is actually, I think, what is like the right deployment model for my parents, for example. They want to have local government controlled economic systems. They don't trust Ethereum. Like the idea that I think we should be building open source software that doesn't rely on the fact that everyone should like connect to our network and like buy our tokens, but rather like that they take the software and go, we can deploy this locally, we can run with this locally, and once you're ready, you can connect to sort of the rest of the world and start communicating with the rest of the world in terms of exchanging value. I think this is sort of very much the perspective that we are coming at this from. So maybe it's the last very practical step that everyone here should be doing, become a ham radio operator. Lots of like intent-based systems are really well designed for like low bandwidth but high latency communication, which works really well over FM and AM radio. It's also really hard to censor, by the way, because censoring AM radio communications causes collateral damage all over the place. So I think we're going to start falling back to a lot of like radio tech. So get ahead of the curve and like become a ham radio operator.
That's actually good advice. Just to give you something slightly different to work with, if we look at systems that have gone to these places that have been really successful, we could look at Linux. But like one of the things that's interesting about early Linux is, I can't remember which book, I think it might be the Media Reader, but it talks about their understanding of like church and their understanding of like religion and how missionary work kind of went into all over the place, all over the planet. And this idea of like collective effervescence being how to create a coalition around like early programming. But I think you coming from the literal global church of Italy, how do you see Swarm becoming part of like kind of that collective effervescence? How do you get people in that locality future to understand the value of decentralized storage? Because they're not really going to come into all of this knowing all the terms we are.
I think that, yeah, like speaking about decentralized storage might be something interesting for the people here. But if I talk about being able to communicate without the NSA spying on you, which is, something that happens, or if I talk about making sure that what you read online is actually what you want to read, and not what Jeff Bezos and Amazon wants you to read, then on that side we can actually make everyone understand why that is important. So it's not talking about the technology, but talking about the problem that we are actually solving, which is empowering agency and letting people decide for themselves without having the US government or without having Amazon or Google or any other central government deciding for you what you can communicate with, what you can communicate about, and also like letting you know that they're tracking your phone. So those are the problems that we are trying to solve. And those are the problems that matter for, I would say, like almost anyone everywhere.
I think so as well. I think that just the example I was giving earlier when we talk about like France and what they're doing with censorship and the future of censorship for them, this is a model that a lot of Western countries are looking at, and it actually is a model that's traceable. Obviously, many of us know about the Arab Spring, but not many of us know about the immediate systems that were put in place to control situations like the Arab Spring happening. So when you look at the way that Syria went down when they started their internet shutdown, they justified it as like part of the education of the community. So many Syrian kids were cheating that when exams came, they had to shut down the internet. And that's where it started, right? And there's been plenty of Western outlets that have supported that and been like, well, nobody tried to talk to Syria this week. They're doing tests. And it's like, no, that was an initial argument, and they based a social order on top of that. And now, Syria, if you look at it, is one of the longest internet shutdowns happening right now, and in the last few years. But also, like, every other country, like France, Ethiopia, in my case, and Iran, they all looked to Syria and saw the apathy of the West. So when we talk about blockchain systems in our last second, I'm going to just give it to you, and then we're going to probably end this. We talk about blockchain systems because I think you're the only one here who's actually a layer 1 founder. and has actually worked with things like Tendermint and these like coalitions of finances that come from establishing this ecosystem. How do we influence policy? How do we influence like social order to understand like what blockchain means is more than just currency? How do you use your vast resources in that way?
Tough questions.
I know.
I think Adrian also qualifies as a L1 founder here, so you could give it to him. But
Yeah. Sorry.
No,
With years under your belt.
Just handing it up. I mean, yeah, it's a really tough. I mean, the problems of censorship resistance and infrastructure you can't shut down is very real. And so, in some sense, we certainly have to stay true to those values. But there's a flip side to it that an unchanging, static, global system is also implies a kind of conservative, dare we say, right-wing politics, right? And so you sort of have to keep that tension in mind, which can be kind of complex to realize that on the one hand, like in order to support freedom in large parts of the world, you have to preserve a kind of conservative political technology that appears neutral, but neutrality is a kind of conservative political position, and that's a challenge I think for all of us. So yeah. I don't know if that really answers your question.
I'll give you a little bit of advice for the future and everyone else. One of the things that's easiest to do in these worlds is just front legal battles around telecommunications happening all over the world. These populations that are being shut off from the internet, they are currently trying to get some justice and some agency, and they're going through the legal system the same way everyone else has tried in all parts of the world. And the issue is always going to be money and finances. So there's plenty of coalitions around the planet that are trying to push for legal justice around telecommunications, and I think the blockchain community would benefit quite a bit from joining that coalition.
Like we should just fund those efforts?
We should, get involved in funding the already existing legal battles around telecommunications coming out of these places.
Amen.
Yeah. All right, folks, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.